Okay, today we're going to talk about the United States deciding to drop the atomic bombs. And before that, what happens prior, which is some island hopping. So while the war in Europe raged on, there was also another theater at the Pacific Theater where World War II was also being fought, but the Japanese were the primary aggressors. So while Allies agreed that the defeat of the Nazis was their very first priority, the United States didn't wait until Victory in Europe Day to move against Japan. Fortunately, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 had missed some of the Pacific Fleet's submarines and had missed some of its aircraft carriers, which were out to sea at the time, and it gave us a starting point from which to do the following. So we're going to use this map to talk about these kind of initial movements. So in the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese conquered an empire that dwarfed Hitler's Third Reich. On the Asian mainland, the Japanese troops had overrun Hong Kong, French Indochina, Burma, Thailand, a lot of China. They also swept through the south and east across the Pacific, conquering the Dutch East Indies, Guam, Wake Island, Solomon Islands, all of those sorts of things. They even took two islands in the Aleutian Island chain. This is the little thing, the islands jutting off of the coast of Alaska. In the Philippines, about 80,000 American and Filipino troops were located right in here. General Douglas MacArthur was in command of the Allied forces there, and when American and Filipino forces found themselves with their backs up against the wall on Bataan, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave. When MacArthur left the Philippines with his wife and son and his staff, he pledged that he shall return, but for now he's been removed out. In the spring of 1942, let's go up here to these Doolittle raids right here. The Allies began to turn the tide against the Japanese. The push began on April 18th with a daring raid on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 bombers in the attack. The next day, Americans woke to headlines that read, "Tokyo bombed, Doolittle did it." So moving on to the Battle of Coral Sea down here, the main Allied forces in the Pacific were Americans and Australians, and in May of 1942 they succeeded in stopping the Japanese advance, the Japanese drive toward Australia. There was a 5-day battle at Coral Sea, and during this battle the fighting was done by airplanes that took off from enormous aircraft carriers, and not a single shot was fired by surface ships. The Battle of Midway, let's move on. Japan's next thrust was toward Midway. It was a strategic island that lies just north and west of Hawaii. Here again, the Allies succeeded in stopping the Japanese. Americans had broken a Japanese code and knew that Midway was to be their next target. Admiral Nimitz, Chester Nimitz, the commander of American naval forces in the Pacific, moved to defend the island, and on June 3rd of 1942, the scout planes found the Japanese fleet. The Americans sent torpedo planes and dive bombers to attack, and the Japanese were caught with their planes still on the decks of their carriers, and the results were devastating for the Japanese. By the end of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese had lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, 250 planes, and this was considered like the avenging of Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway was considered a turning point in the war as well. Now the Allies go on the kind of offensive. In August of 1942, about 19,000 troops stormed Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, and by that time the Japanese had decided that they were going to abandon Guadalcanal. About 6 months later, they called it the Island of Death, and there were all sorts of different types of spiders and ants that bit on that island. Okay, moving to 1945. We're skipping a couple islands here. Iwo Jima. After retaking much of the Philippines and liberating American prisoners of war there, Douglas MacArthur and the Allies turned to Iwo Jima, an island that William Manchester later described as an ugly, smelly glob of cold lava squatting in the ocean. Iwo Jima means Sulphur Island in Japanese, and it was critical to the United States as a base from which the heavily loaded bombers might actually reach Japan. But it was also really heavily defended. It had about 20,000 Japanese troops entrenched in tunnels and caves. More than 6,000 Marines died taking the desolate island. and this was the greatest number in any battle in the Pacific up to that point. Only 200 Japanese survived. Moving on to Okinawa, in April of 1945, U.S. Marines invaded Okinawa. The Japanese unleashed more than 1,900 kamikaze attacks on the Allies during this campaign, sinking 30 ships, damaging 300 more, killing almost 5,000 seamen. Once ashore, the Allies faced even greater opposition. By the time fighting ended on June 21st of 1945, more than 7,600 Americans had died, but the Japanese had paid with 110,000 lives. So what we'll talk about next in a little bit more detail are the two big yellow dots, which is, of course, at this point, the United States has to decide what about the mainland of Japan? What is our strategy going to be around that? After taking Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it opened the way for an invasion of Japan. Allied leaders knew that such an invasion would become a desperate struggle. Japan still had a huge army that would defend, they thought, every inch of their homeland. President Truman saw only one way to avoid an invasion of Japan. He decided to use a brand new powerful weapon that had been developed by scientists working on the Manhattan Project. Oopsie. The Manhattan Project was led by an American scientist named Robert Oppenheimer. He's right down here. Robert Oppenheimer led Americans in the development of the atomic bomb. He was not only the most ambitious scientific, it was one of the most ambitious scientific enterprises in history, but it was also an extremely well-kept secret. At its peak, there were more than 600,000 Americans involved in the project, but very few people actually knew of its ultimate purpose. In fact, there were plants spread out through the United States, and actually one in Canada, I believe, where different parts were being purposed. And even Harry Truman, who had just become president as FDR dies in 1945, kind of unexpectedly. When Truman becomes president, even he as vice president hadn't known about the Manhattan Project. That's how well they were keeping this a secret. Even Truman didn't learn about the project until he actually became president, and then had to make a very quick decision about whether to utilize it or not. The first test of the new bomb took place on the morning of July 16, 1945, in an empty expanse of desert near New Mexico, near Alamogordo, New Mexico. A blinding flash, which was visible for 180 miles away, was followed by a deafening roar as a tremendous shock wave rolled across the trembling desert. Otto Frisch, a scientist on the project, described the huge mushroom cloud that rose over the desert as a red, hot elephant standing balanced on its trunk. The bomb had obviously worked. President Truman now faced a really difficult decision whether the Allies should use the bomb to bring an end to the war. Truman didn't hesitate. On July 25th of 1945, he ordered the military to make final plans for dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japanese targets. A day later, the United States warned Japan that it faced prompt and utter destruction unless it surrendered at once. Japan refused. Some resources say that there were hundreds of thousands of pamphlets, littered, that were strung about over top of the Japanese island to try to convince the Japanese population to encourage the Japanese leadership to surrender. Truman later wrote, "The final decision of where and when to use the atomic bombs was up to me, but let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used." On August 6th, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay released an atomic bomb coded Little Boy over Hiroshima. Some people say Hiroshima, and that's okay too. An important Japanese military target. 43 seconds later, almost every building in the city collapsed into dust from the force of the blast. Hiroshima had ceased to exist. Still, Japan's leaders hesitated to surrender. 3 days later, a second bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, leveling half the city. By the end of the year, an estimated 200,000 people had died as a result of injuries and radiation poisoning that had been caused by the atomic blast. Emperor Hirohito was horrified by the destruction wrought upon the city by his country by the bombs. And he said, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." He ordered them to drop the papers to end the war, and on September 2nd, formal surrender ceremonies took place on a U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. "Today the guns are silent," said General MacArthur in a speech. "The skies no longer rain death, the seas bear only commerce. Men everywhere walk upright in the sunlight, and the entire world is quietly at peace."
Dawn, 850 miles from Japan. An American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, carries the most destructive weapon in the history of mankind.
I've been entrusted with the most frightful weapon ever devised. I thought, yes, we're gonna kill a lot of people. By God, we're gonna save a lot of lives.
We have the power that we have always reserved only for God. We now have it to end everything. It's in human power. That pervades every single part of our lives today.
The men aboard the Enola Gay knew what they had to do, and they focused on the details of that mission in order to execute it. No one really knows what's going to happen once this bomb leaves that aircraft.
9:14 a.m. A 60-second warning tone. Below them, a city of 350,000 people. Has 43 seconds to escape the blast zone. An explosion 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The bomb kills more than 60,000 instantly. Three days later, a second atom bomb. Japan surrenders.
It's the most fearsome thing this world can unleash. That's why we've only seen two in the history of the world.
Since 1945, mankind has been living in the atomic age. Today, there are over 19,000 nuclear warheads, able to destroy our species 20 times over.
With atomic weapons, we finally hit that point of sort of a spiritual crisis. Have we gone too far? And what does it mean that we can control this most elemental of forces with such awesome destructive power?
But with a terrible weapon also comes a revolutionary source of energy.